Hello, class. I want to go over some of the more difficult learning objectives for Unit 4 as you prepare for this exam. This unit has chapters 15 through 18, but I also included chapter 23 in there on the Great Plains, which is a very short chapter, just because there are other chapters on the west, the two earlier chapters, 16 and 17, and I thought that would fit in there well, geographically at least. The way the legislature divides up our 1301 and 1302 courses, they're using the Civil War and Reconstruction as the cutoff line. So the West straddles those chronological eras. So I thought this chapter 23 maybe fit better in Unit 4. But let's go ahead and move on up into chapter 15, which does not have a lot of particularly difficult learning objectives. This is the chapter on slavery. But it is a very important chapter, and you want to know the basics of where enslaved workers came from in Africa, how most of them came usually to Latin America first as a staging area here, especially the Caribbean, before they worked their way up into the area that's now the United States. But also how much slavery varied within the 13 colonies and then later the states, depending on region, depending on the concentration of enslaved workers. Know about the importance of religion and the book of Exodus, especially from the Old Testament, which has a huge narrative thread that runs through American history in a lot of different ways, including the Puritans who saw themselves as a chosen people on a path similar to Moses leading his people out of Egypt to the Promised Land, but also Brigham Young, the Mormon of the West, leading the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints out of the Midwest into Utah. Same with enslaved workers, also put a big emphasis on this book. Understand why slave owners and slave runners were focused on shuffling slaves around so that you didn't have a lot from the same part of Africa together. Understand the importance, the obsession really with skin tone, skin color. Understand the early abolition movement, understand the resistance movement. With any of those learning objectives, all of them important. Feel free to email me or talk to me if you have further questions, but we haven't had a lot of problem on exams with chapter 15 or 16, which involves the American West, and also very straightforward. I think the most difficult learning objective probably in chapter 16 is the one involving polygamy and the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court's reasoning in Reynolds v. U.S. of 1878. This is LO 16-6. Why did the court ban polygamy in the United States is an interesting question, because you could make an argument that consenting adults ought to have the liberty to arrange themselves in whatever manner they so desire, as long as they're not harming other people, that's a fundamental religious right. This is an interesting case in a couple ways. One is that the court, rather than doing its usual practice of looking at precedent and what the Constitution has to say and how the court has ruled in previous years, they really go all the way back to English common law and say this is just not a normal thing for our civilization as defined by that which came out of English common law, which is not something the court has a habit of doing. In fact, I can't think of really any other examples off the top of my head where they used English common law dating back to the Middle Ages as their precedent. But in any event, the upshot is that this is where the Supreme Court really nuanced their interpretation of the religious freedom right in the First Amendment by distinguishing between religious belief and religious practice. And at some point, they really had to split hairs there. They had to distinguish between those two things. You could think of an even more dramatic example. Think of if there was a religious group or some crazy cult that was practicing human sacrifice. Well, that would violate the murder laws in the United States, and those would override the religious freedom concerns. So at some point, they would have had to distinguish between religious freedom and religious practice anyway. But this happens to be the case that they did it in, was polygamy. And it's really part of how the United States conquered the West. They didn't just conquer Native Americans and Mexicans in the West. They also conquered a rogue group of white Americans, who were the Mormons, who went and really laid claim to the West as their own country, or a pretty significant chunk of it. And outlawing polygamy was one way that the United States assimilated Mormons more into mainstream society. The next chapter on the West focuses more on the Southwest, including Texas. There's a huge section there on the Texas independence movement and Texas Revolution, which a lot of you have had quite a bit of experience with in junior high or high school courses, at least those of you who went to public schools here in Texas. I think one of the interesting things about this, and this pops in learning objective number 5, in terms of how the United States ended up controlling the Southwest, it really wasn't a straightforward case of military conquest, at least at first. Really, the country of Mexico, shortly after it had gained its independence from Spain in 1821, really had a very liberal immigration policy in terms of inviting people from the United States into this northeasternmost state within their country, hoping to develop it economically, hoping to also create a sort of human buffer zone here from raiding Indian parties that might threaten their gold and silver mines down in the middle part of the country, but also a very liberal economic policy in terms of free trade. And they really created a monster there when too many white Americans came into Texas, began to outnumber Tejanos in Texas. But there were other sources of conflict, including the fact that a lot of the early American settlers or U.S. settlers that came into Tejas were slave holders, especially down in this part of the state down here. And Mexico outlawed slavery in the 1830s. But also, these Americans were used to a high degree of religious freedom, as they had enjoyed in the United States, and Catholicism was the official state religion. Well, a number of one thing led to another, but you can read more about how the Texicans or the Texians or the Texicanos, as they were sometimes called back then, rose up in rebellion against the country of Mexico. And this is really the first part of Mexico to gain independence. But that was really a precursor to what happened then further out west, including in California during the Mexican War. One of the things that's interesting about the Mexican War, and this is touched on in LO 17.8, is why it was that the U.S. gave back the bottom half of Mexico, even though that had been the most contentious and violent part of the Mexican War, was the struggle for the part that currently is still Mexico. And I think a lot of that has to do with this flat-out anti-immigration sentiment that was brewing in the United States already against immigrants, especially from Catholic areas. There's a big anti-Catholic, anti-immigration group known officially as the Star-Spangled Banner Party, but known informally as the Know Nothing Party, because when they harassed and killed immigrants, they were told to, if they were asked about it, they were told to say, "I know nothing." But this was really heating up in the United States. This became, in fact, a pretty major political party in the years before the Civil War. And we forget about them because they got washed over by the Civil War and other concerns. The sectional crisis ended up being much bigger than the anti-immigration sentiment, which pops up from time to time in American history. But really, the Know Nothings wanted to retain America's identity as a so-called WASP country. And when I say WASP, I refer here not to the little yellow and black bugs, but the acronym White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, that is the core identity of what it means to be an American. We still continue to wrestle with that up to this very day. But in 1848, that was really why Congress didn't incorporate Mexico, because there were a lot of people who said, hey, the United States should there was a version of Manifest Destiny that foretold the United States taking over all of the Western Hemisphere, including all of Latin America. All of these would be part of one big country. The capital out here in Washington, D.C., probably be moved to Mexico City instead, because that would be more centrally located. Why did that not happen? Because Congress and the American people decided they didn't want to bring that many Catholic Hispanic people into the population. So things went another direction, and Mexico got to retain the bottom half of its own country, I guess you could say, after the war with the United States. Moving on up into the chapter on the sectional crisis, chapter 18. This chapter has a lot of different LOs that I think are a little bit problematic. First, you can analyze this Compromise of 1850, which I think is a classic example of how different history looks in hindsight. We have the benefit of hindsight and perspective when we look back. They say hindsight is 2020. Whereas people moving forward through history, the way we are moving forward through the 2020s, for instance, they can't tell what's going to happen. There's no way to predict what next year will bring. But the Mexican War really triggered a major sectional argument over the expansion of slavery from the Southeast into the West. Whoever got control of the West would ultimately get control of the future and control of the United States because of the way we allot representation in Congress. So they were pretty evenly divided between the North and South for a long time. But then you had the controversy over whether Texas would come in as a state. That's obviously going to add in a lot more representatives into the lower house. But also, if Texas were to divide itself up into 5 or 6 smaller states, then they would also be able to expand how many senators they had, not just 2, but 10 or 12. Well, they eventually decided they weren't going to allow Texas to do that. That's one of the reasons we're so big. However, we're not nearly as big as we used to be. When we used to go all the way up here, I used to be able to go skiing up in Vail and still be in Texas, because one of the things that they compromised on was shrinking Texas down to its current boundaries with the Compromise of 1850. They also brought in California as a free state to balance off Texas as a slave state. They also made the North promise to start enforcing the Fugitive Slave Clause, which is really part of the Constitution to begin with, but they beefed it up even more in 1850. That ended up backfiring a little bit because that brought in a lot of Northerners who were otherwise maybe apathetic toward the slave issue. It was really forcing them to be complicit in slavery by cooperating with bounty hunters as they went to round up escaped slaves in the North. They also outlawed slavery within the actual District of Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, although they had to shrink the District of Columbia down a little bit because there were a couple of major slave auctions there in Georgetown and Alexandria. But a lot of Northerners thought, oh, that's uncivilized to have these huge auctions going on right next to the U.S. Capitol. It's embarrassing in terms of foreign visitors, etc. They also came up with an idea of how to handle the West here that really started to officially at this point now ignore the old Missouri Compromise line, the southern border of Missouri that they had agreed on back in 1820, the 3630 latitudinal line. Really, neither side seemed particularly interested in that by the 1850s. But what about the New Mexico territory, or what's now New Mexico and Arizona? They opened that up to so-called free sovereignty or popular sovereignty, sometimes known as squatter sovereignty. The basic idea being that as those areas moved from territorial status to becoming states, they could then decide that issue on their own. Very democratic, local government, they could figure out on their own. Seemed to work okay out in the Southwest, and I think that was illusory due to the fact that there just weren't very many people out there. Because when they tried this same idea 4 years later over here in the Kansas territory, which is not just the present state of Kansas here, but really included at that time really a huge chunk of the Great Plains, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, all the way up into Montana, etc. They tried that there in 1854, said they were going to leave it up to the people out there to decide on their own. There it really backfired, and the system broke down and became dysfunctional. And you had a lot of anti-slavery, jayhawkers, free soilers, etc., rushing into Kansas to lay claim to it. A lot of border ruffians, pro-slavery people from Missouri rushing over there, or from other parts of the Southeast. These two groups then fought it out in what's known as Bleeding Kansas. And the national government, the idea of letting the people decide on their own, sounds great, but it's also a way to wash your hands of the problem and basically shove the problem off onto the territories. Really was in retrospect a preamble or sort of a preview or of the Civil War. If you were going to write a book about the Civil War, you might have an early chapter on Bleeding Kansas as a lead up to it. So it backfired in a big way, led then to lots of arguments back here in Washington, D.C., and really the breakdown of Congress as a civil functioning mechanism whereby to figure out the nation's problems, they're starting to fight in Congress and take their pistols to Congress and challenge each other and this sort of thing. You can read about the Charles Sumner, the caning of Charles Sumner, kind of a colorful story there in the 1850s. And really, in a way, led to a real shakeup of the two-party system and the creation of a new party. And that is the Republican Party of today. The Republicans that we talked about back in the 1790s, they gradually became the Democratic Republicans, and then they became the Democrats. So they're more the precursor to today's party of Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, etc. The modern Republican Party really has its origins in the 1850s, especially post-Bleeding Kansas, where a lot of Northerners decided that they were going to take a stronger stand. They weren't going to become necessarily a single party. A single issue party, but they're more or less a single issue party, and they had some other issues that they tack along with it. But some of the old issues of the old Whig Party, which was now breaking down along sectional lines, even the old Federalist Party, pro-business type platform. But they begin to take shape then in the mid-1850s, and this creates a dangerous situation because they really were a purely Northern party. And they got some, Northern Whigs to hop on with them, and a few Northern Democrats switched over, etc. There had been a purely single-issue party called the Free Soil Party. They melted in with the new Republican Party. The Democratic Party still had elements in both the North and South, but they were now gradually morphing into a purely Southern party. This creates a very dangerous situation in the United States if you have the regionalization of parties. But I think that follows on the heels of regionalization culturally and religiously and economically, where you really have two different economic systems developing, one in the North really putting a lot of emphasis and pride, in fact, in upward mobility as the American way, that you can make it in America. You can go from rags to riches in this new industrialized economy, whereas the Southeastern economy was much more traditional. They could make a claim that they were more like the ancient Greeks and Romans, or like Europe, which is to say the wealth was really in the land. It was a landed aristocracy, and you didn't have a lot of room for upward mobility. Poor whites had no particular way to work their way up through the system. They couldn't get reborn to different parents. And you can see the churches, also the three mainline Protestant denominations, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists. All three of those denominations broke into northern and southern branches before the political parties broke up into northern and southern branches. So very ominous signs then throughout the 1850s that despite the Compromise of 1850, where they thought they had solved these problems, that these problems were not going to go away. And the Supreme Court case here with Dred Scott v. Sanford, and this is Learning Objective 18.8. This one really also throws a monkey wrench into any hope of compromise in the future, because James Buchanan, who was the incoming president just prior to Abraham Lincoln, he had really wanted the Supreme Court to sort of solve this issue of the Western expansion of slavery once and for all, kind of take care of it, have some sort of blanket ruling from the Supreme Court that no politicians would be able to argue with later. Boy, did that ever backfire. Dred Scott, by the way, was an enslaved worker from Missouri who was owned by an army doctor who had taken him up into free territory up in Wisconsin and Minnesota for a considerable number of years. And that raised the question, how long can you keep an enslaved worker in a free territory where slavery is illegal, or you are just there temporarily with the military, or if you're on vacation? The southern planters back, and this is before air conditioning, they used to oftentimes leave overseers behind in the southeast, and they would go up in summer up in Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket Island off of Massachusetts. They would take slaves with them. That was generally sort of winked at as something that was okay to do for a couple months. This was a bigger issue, but the upshot is that the Supreme Court under Justice Taney, I realize it's spelled Taney in the textbook, but there is a W in there in terms of the pronunciation. He really issued this blanket ruling that no, Dred Scott would not be awarded his freedom, but that moreover, no person of African descent, whether free or slave, could even use the could even use the courtroom in the United States. They had no standing whatsoever in America. But he also then said that any restriction on slavery in the West, and the West was mainly all territories at this point rather than states other than California, no restriction on slavery was legal. That was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution regarding protecting property rights. That's really the same idea that John C. Calhoun had, the senator from South Carolina that was somewhat of a fire-eating, very, very staunch pro-slavery advocate. So this seemed to be saying that the national government was squashing on the very core idea of the new Republican Party, which was that they were going to prevent the expansion of slavery in the West. When I said that the Republican Party had become a single issue party, what I meant was they wanted to stop the extension of slavery in the West, even though they were going to allow it to continue here in the Southeast. Abraham Lincoln, who had been a Whig back in the days of the Mexican War, and the Mexican War, like I said, was very divisive between the North and South because a lot of Northerners, like Abraham Lincoln, thought that Southern planters were just using as an excuse to expand slavery into the Southwest, which is probably exactly what they were trying to do. He had retired from politics. Now he's going to come back into politics, into this new Republican Party. And he runs for the senatorial seat in Illinois against Stephen Douglas, who had been the one that crafted the Kansas-Nebraska Act, whereby Kansas was going to come in as a free sovereignty territory where they were going to let people out there decide on their own. Really what Douglas wanted most of all is he just wanted to get a transcontinental railroad built from this sleepy little village here at the bottom southwest corner of Michigan called Chicago out to San Francisco and the gold rush, because that would help his home state of Illinois a lot. So he had rushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through because he thought that it'd be easier to build a railroad through the West if those were U.S. territories, be easier to cope with Native Americans, etc. So he was still sticking to this free sovereignty idea. And what Lincoln is saying here, and this is what I'm asking about in Learning Objective 18.8, is how can you continue to be talking about this idea of free sovereignty or popular sovereignty when the Supreme Court just said in the Dred Scott ruling over here that any ban on any restriction on slavery in the territories is illegal? Those two things contradict each other. Well, then Douglas shot back at Lincoln that he was too pro-black, that this new Republican Party was pro-black, and that put Lincoln on the defensive. And this is where Lincoln probably issues some of his more controversial or racist quotes. But it's also where Lincoln, in this 1858 senatorial election in Illinois, this is where Lincoln really takes a stand and on slavery and says, we will not allow its extension out west. So in fact, what you have here is Abraham Lincoln agrees with John C. Calhoun of South Carolina and agrees with the Supreme Court that the national government should decide the fate of slavery out west rather than leaving it up to the settlers with free sovereignty or popular sovereignty. They did agree that this should be a national government right rather than a state right. They just disagreed on which ruling they should have. So Lincoln said, hey, if you had a bunch of rats in your barn, if your barn was infested with rats, probably wouldn't be worth burning the barn down to kill the rats. However, if you went and built a new barn, you probably wouldn't go round up the rats and go throw them into the new barn. Now, what he was talking about was the evil of slavery as an institution. But the way the new Republican Party incorporated Lincoln's views was they really expanded on that, and they kind of ended up using racism to argue against slavery. And that's what I'm talking about there in Learning Objective 18.9. How could you use racism against slavery? Republican Party's new mantra was free soil, free labor, free men. But you have to understand that the majority of Northerners were not abolitionists. People like William Lloyd Garrison, for instance, that we talked about in the slavery chapter, chapter 15. Those were quite a rare minority. They were seen as really sort of a nuisance. Harriet Beecher Stowe began to take abolitionism a little bit more mainstream. She made it a little bit more popular. And I think that the Fugitive Slave Clause and the idea of Northerners aiding and abetting bounty hunters also turned a few more Northerners against slavery. The vast majority of Northerners didn't care, or they were racist. And so what the new GOP was saying is, hey, do you want the West open for you as free white wage workers, or do you want the slaves to do the work out West? Because it's one or the other. Is the work going to be for enslaved workers, or are the jobs going to be for free white wage workers? And so a lot of these free soil states then, initially Iowa, Minnesota, Oregon, all of them really, they not only did they outlaw slavery, but they also outlawed free blacks. So this vision of a free soil country was a white vision. They didn't actually have the white in bracket there. I added that for you because that was implied. That is absolutely what they meant. They not only did they not like slavery, but really one of the reasons they didn't like slavery is that the slaves were black. So you could think of, in that way, you could think of the Civil War as two incompatible versions of slavery running into each other. They were not going to be able to coexist. One had to give way to the other. And that's one way of interpreting what the Civil War was about, or what this is an argument over what is the future of the country going to be like. Is this going to be a country full of free white workers, or is this going to be a country full of unfree enslaved workers, one or the other? Lots of different causes to the Civil War behind that. But you could think of that as the basis of this emerging rivalry between the new Republican Party of the 1850s and the old Southern Democrats, who are then going to go on and form the Confederacy. All right, well, that's enough for today. Good luck preparing for the last exam. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the chapter 23 here. It's a very small chapter. People have had no problem dealing with the learning objectives. If there's one learning objective maybe that I would want to touch on a little bit from chapter 23, it would be learning objective number 1, where it talks about summarizing the role of the federal government in settling the Great Plains. The West has always been very contradictory in terms of that's where we most identify with individualism and freedom and self-reliance, and we have this image of people out there who hate the government and they don't want them telling them what to do with their land and all of that. Yet at the same time, those same people have always been far more reliant on the federal government than any other part of the country. So there are lots of ways that that's true today. In terms of subsidies and other things. But back in the 19th century, really, with the new Republican Party led by Abraham Lincoln, once they got into the Civil War and the South had left the United States, that gave the new Republican Party a green light to do whatever they wanted to not only win the Civil War, which would allow them to take the West, but they could settle the West however they wanted. And they were going to do that with massive federal government interference in the form of they would buy the railroads that would then connect the East all the way out to California, which back before railroads and before telegraphs, that was a long, long ways away. We don't think of it so much like that now, but Lincoln, when he came into office in 1861, he thought of himself as inheriting three countries where he wanted one. It had the original United States had now been divided into two. The Confederacy was trying to form their own country. He was going to use force to bring them back into the United States against their will, say, no, we're going to keep the United States intact. But you also had California, which was way out there, and the areas in between weren't settled. The Great Plains and the Mountain West didn't have a lot of American settlers. So they were really developing their own economy. They had plenty of currency to develop their own economy because they had gold. And it seemed almost like they were going to become either a different country, or maybe they would be, who knows what, colonized by the British or some other country or what. So he wanted to really kind of reach out to them in the form of both the telegraph and the railroad. So you have this huge, it ended up being a boondoggle, a lot of money disappeared, et cetera. And a lot of the early construction on the Transcontinental Railroad left something to be desired. But you had this huge expansion with infrastructure. But two other forms of government interference were the Morrill Land Grant Act, where the government was then going to grant land for the new territories to build universities on, that were really emphasizing agricultural and mechanical arts especially. So you could see, you can envision a college ending with A&M, or a lot of the colleges that we now see ending with the word state, like Iowa State, Kansas State, etc. Those are land grant colleges that Lincoln helped bring about. And then also finally, with what you see here in this notice, or this old poster, is the Homestead Act. Of course, both with the Homestead Act and the land grants, that land was being taken from Americans directly. So the Union was really, in a way, fighting two wars at the same time, because they were fighting the Confederacy, and most of their troops were oriented, were back east or down in the Mississippi, Louisiana area, fighting against the Confederates, or up in Virginia especially. But then there were also a lot of Union Army forces out in the West, even more after the Civil War ended, who were fighting against Indians to take control of the Great Plains. Really the last part of the continental United States, where you had a lot of conflict between Americans and Indians. But what you see there with the Republican vision of individual freedom and individual self-reliance and pulling oneself up by the bootstraps is that you need to do the work, you need to put in the effort to farm your land and go to college, etc. But we're going to help you do that. We're going to create a framework for you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps with. So we are going to create, through the government, public universities, and we are going to either give you land and let you keep it if you cultivate it and do it correctly, or at least sell it to you very cheap. So the government has a huge role then in creating a framework for individualism and self-reliance out west, is, I think, a better way of looking at it than just a big region where, hey, it was a laissez-faire, free-for-all, and you could go out there and do whatever you wanted. That was true in the West, further back in the 1820s, 1830s, and obviously before that, but not really in the post-Civil War era. Okay, now I actually finally am done, and I'll let you go and study hard for the Unit 4 exam. Good luck.